And most of this I have to credit Ryan, because he's been running these models in our lab, so all credit to him. And a grad student named Michelle Stern, now Dr. Michelle Stern, was involved with this project for looking at potatoes. So we'll just jump right in. And the dots here are the populations of sea monkey flower that we're looking at, and the goal was to try to get climate and hydrology predictor variables that could be used systematically across that entire range. So we set out to do that, and we used a model called the basin characterization model. And basically what it does is it's going to intersect precip, and the BCM can be used on any time step. We're using it on a monthly time step. And I'll explain a little bit of our variables that we selected for input to it in a minute. But it takes precip and it'll fill up the water storage capacity, the soil moisture capacity, to field capacity. Anything beyond that is going to become recharge or runoff. And then it has a number of other modules. And it's been calibrated for many of these modules. So it starts with precip and air temperature. Depending on the air temperature, it'll build snow and it'll melt it. It'll get us an April 1st snowpack. This ground level component which includes soil depth, porosity, geology, topography. It outputs, if you get past soil moisture holding capacity, you get either runoff or recharge. And the runoff has been calibrated to about 127 unimpeded stream gauges in California. So it calculates this on a per grid cell basis. We can then calculate the runoff in a basin to a particular location. If the prediction of the model is off relative to what the gauge is telling us, we can modify that to make it work. And similarly, it's been calibrated for snow from a variety of different snow metrics. But we didn't have a metric for how do we handle this energy balance over here, which starts with solar radiation, intersects with temperature to come up with a potential ET. And then, of course, potential is limited by how much water is actually in the soil. So you could get as much rain as you could imagine, but only the water that's in the soil is available to the plants. So the actual is limiting in drought-prone areas the amount of ET that can occur, and the difference of those, climatic water deficit, is an index of plant water stress. And so we wanted to launch into how could we calculate CWD. But we're already fairly pleased with it, because you can see, for example, on these northeast facing slopes there was, or southwest facing slopes, there were higher CWD values, more stress, and in the north facing less stress. So it's quite responsive to topography. And so the way that we tried to calibrate for ET was that we used a NASA product from a scientist named Reitz. And she has a 1 kilometer time series of actual evapotranspiration that's coming from satellite measured and then run through an algorithm to give us a square kilometer by square kilometer ET values for the lower 48. And we took that and we said, okay, well, we can find 1 kilometer groupings of dominant vegetation in California. So it might be, 1 kilometer of coast redwood or blue oak woodland or grassland, and we can use these habitat types and we can find where they're relatively contiguous, and we can look to see what is the ET that the Reitz data is giving us versus what was our model actually putting out, and then we could actually calibrate that. And the way that we, so here's the Reitz data on a yearly time scale for about 30 different California vegetation types, just to illustrate that they have differences between them. And the way that we could then calibrate it is by modifying the effective soil storage by 5% components until we reached, the black would be the Reitz data, and then these would be our tuning in to getting to that same level of ET with the model by modifying the storage. And in some cases, that ties back to the idea of weathering rinds. So some of these trees have roots that go down past the soil and go into the decomposing rock and into groundwater components. For example, during the 2012 to 2016 drought, there was much less tree mortality in northwest California in the mudstones than there was in the same tree species in the northern Sierra over granite. So this is just showing that for many of the different veg types, and Doug fir was our biggest modification, how much additional effective rooting volume we had to add to account for the amount of ET that the REACH data was telling us was occurring. So once we had done that, I was quite pleased that it did a number of things. It addressed inaccuracies in soil depth and soil porosity in soil maps. So soil maps are notoriously problematic, and by changing the rooting depth, we could then come up with a surface of effective rooting depth that you see on the right-hand side. And then it allowed us to do things that I thought were consistent with phenological conditions. So here's a July temperature value, or a July ET value. And you can see that already in the driest and hottest part of the Central Valley for blue oak woodland, it's already dried out. But in certain parts of the higher parts of the Sierra foothills, it's not as dried out, right? And so that spatial patterning was helpful. Similarly with grasslands, we could see much more ET in January, and then they're drying out by July. And it allowed us to then, I think this is also interesting. So now here's our ET for different major vegetation types, right? And the highest elevation ones are in green, and they're maxing out their ET somewhere in August, whereas the lower elevation annual grasslands and blue oak woodland are maxing out earlier in the spring, right? So we're actually now, our ET model is capturing what we think of as elevational dynamics in terms of where the maximum ET is going as temperatures warm up. Kind of tying back to Jill's comment about when does temperature interact with snow. So then, what historical data did you use to go into the model, I hear you cry? Well, Michelle tackled that one by looking at 1,231 weather stations in California and comparing 5 different historical climate skins to those, including Climate NA, PRISM, which is a product out of Oregon State, and several others. And what we basically found was we looked at the bias, and I'll just draw your attention to the dark blue on the far left of these ones. So that here's all the different categories. There's PRISM, LIVNA, DayMet, and Climate NA. And PRISM performed the best for precip. It had the least error. It had slightly more error than DayMet or Climate NA but by 1/10 for absolute Tmin, and similarly for or Tmax and Tmin. So overall it performed the best, and so we've used that as the input model. We downscale it to 270 meters for California, and then we run the BCM at 270 meters, we've done that's already available online through the USGS, but Michelle is the keeper of that now, and now we are engaged with. And so there you get another view of the sort of the fine scale CWD for the Bay Area. Now we're engaged with rendering that to 90 meters. And so this came out of a request from Southern California where people are doing regional conservation and forestry and sort of regional resilience planning, and they're like, 270 meters is still kind of generalized. We'd like to get something that's a little bit more point on, and so we're building a 90-meter version of all of the output variables that you saw, all of those outer boxes from the beginning, including snow and runoff, recharge, PET, AET, and CWD, 90 meters. We've got that now from 1900 to, I think, 2024. It's about 14 terabytes of data, and so reducing that down into either 30-year normals or into whatever type of sampling. But we've essentially pulled for, fortunately Ren didn't have to have the 90-meter data, so she's got the 270 version, but we pulled the data for all of those sites, for all those 100 and odd sites, out of the BCM for those locations. So really this talk is really just an introduction to some of the variables that Ren is using. It has nothing other than that possibly of interest for you. Let's see. Yeah, so there's another view. We also extended land cover mapping into the watersheds that flow into California from Mexico, so we think we've got the best land cover map now for a small portion of Mexico. And the next steps, well, she being Michelle Stern for her dissertation, was pushing it further by saying, okay, I want to look at the dynamics of soil moisture at different depths. This was done at Pepperwood Reserve, not far from here over in Sonoma. And then tying that to a tree sensor, essentially sap flow, and then looking at leaf moisture from drones, as measured by airborne drones, and then trying to maybe tie that back to satellites, to saying, okay, we have all these processes of moisture that are occurring. How long does moisture stay? Is there a lag time between when it rains and when you run out of moisture at 50 centimeters down or 100 centimeters down? So and those types of dynamics, if we can understand them, then we might be able to build better hydroclimatic variables. So with that, thank you very much.